We're going to learn Eirovin Daf Tzadik Tes. We're going to start 10 lines from the bottom of Daf Tzadik Ches Amud Beis from the next Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Oimeid Odom B'Reshus HaYochid, a person is allowed to stand in Reshus HaYochid, Umetaltel B'Reshus HaRabim, and whilst standing in the Reshus HaYochid, he can stretch his hands out over the Reshus HaRabim and move something in the Reshus HaRabim. And we'll soon see that that's providing that he does not move the object 4 amos or more. B'Reshus HaRabim u'metaltel b'Reshus HaYochid. For the same token, a person can stand in Reshus HaRabim and move something in a Reshus HaYochid. And that he can do even beyond 4 amos, because the object in the Reshus HaYochid is allowed to be moved in the Reshus HaYochid without any restrictions. And regarding the first halacha, of somebody standing in Reshus HaYochid and moving an object in Reshus HaRabim, ubilvad shelo yotzi chutz me4 amos, he has to make sure the object does not move outside its original 4 amos. One's not allowed to move anything in Reshus HaRabim beyond 4 amos. Continues the Mishnah, Lo yamoid odom b'Reshus HaYochid, the person is not allowed to stand in Reshus HaYochid, v'yashtin b'Reshus HaRabim, and urinate into a public domain, because that way he's causing the urine to leave one Reshus and go into another Reshus, and that's something which is not allowed. B'Reshus HaRabim v'yashtin b'Reshus HaYochid, nor is a person allowed to stand in the Reshus HaRabim and urinate into a Reshus HaYochid. V'chein lo yorik, a person is not allowed to spit from one Reshus into another Reshus. Rabbi Yehuda says an even greater chiddush than that, Af mishenitlash roikei b'piv. If a person has saliva in his mouth, and the salivas become detached, so to speak, which means it's been collected and gathered in his mouth, then since it's considered a burden for him, then lo yahalech 4 amos ach yorik, he's not allowed to walk with the saliva in his mouth. He's not allowed to walk 4 amos with it in its mouth. It's considered that he's carrying the saliva in the Reshus HaRabim 4 amos, which is osa. Ach yorik, he has to spit it out before reaching the 4 amos mark. Says the Gemara, Masni le Rav Chinina bar Shalamyo lechior barav kamei derav. The nusach that Rav Chinina bar Shalamyo etc. said in front of Rav to Chir Barav, he said, the version he said was Lo yamoid odom b'Reshus HaYochid u'metaltel b'Reshus HaRabim. Contrary to what it says in our Mishnah that Oimeid odom b'Reshus HaYochid u'metaltel b'Reshus HaRabim, he learnt in his version of the Mishnah that a person may not stand in one domain whilst moving an object in a different domain. Lo yamoid odom b'Reshus HaYochid u'metaltel b'Reshus HaRabim. Omar li. So he said to him, Shavkas Rabbanon, have you left the halacha of the Chachomim, the Rabbanon, which is our Mishnah, V'ovdas Rab Meir, and you seem to be following the opinion of Rab Meir in a Mishnah on Daf Kuf Aleph, that seems to say that according to Rab Meir, one may not stand in one Reshus, moving an object in another Reshus, contrary to what it says in our Mishnah. Answers the Gemara, Hu Sovar, this Reb Chinina bar Shlamya, he maintained Midas Sefer Reb Meir, Reisha Namim Reb Meir. Since the Mishnah later on Daf Kuf Aleph is the opinion of Reb Meir that one may not carry from in one domain while standing in another domain, he holds that the Reisha, which is our Mishnah, is also Reb Meir, and he must have had the version in our Mishnah, not that Oimeid Odom b'Reshus HaYochid, etc., rather, Lo yamoid Odom. V'loihi. But the Gemara says that's not the case. Say for Reb Meir, indeed the Mishnah on Daf Kuf Aleph is Reb Meir, V'reisha Rabbanon, but this Mishnah is the Rabbanon who argues with Reb Meir and says that Oimeid Odom b'Reshus HaYochid u'metaltel b'Reshus HaRabim, etc. Continues the Gemara. Ubilvad shelo yotzi chutz. We saw in the Mishnah that the Mishnah said that one's only allowed to move something in one domain while standing in another domain. And as we explained when we learned the Mishnah, this is referring to standing in the Reshus HaYochid and moving an item in the Reshus HaRabim, that's provided that he does not move the item outside its 4 amos. Now what's the scene here? We assume it to be that the person is standing on a rooftop, and a rooftop is always going to be, or typically would be a Reshus HaYochid, it's more than 10 tfachim high, and he would reach out to an item in the Rishus Harabim. And now we assume that the way he does it, the way he's moving it, he's lifting it off the Rishus Harabim, up towards himself above 10 tefachim off the ground, moving it however much he's moving it, and then putting it back down into the Rishus Harabim. And according to our Mishnah, he's allowed to do that, providing that he does not move it 4 amos. Says the Gemara, we can deduce from our Mishnah, if he did move it outside its 4 amos, chayev chatos, he's going to be chayev because he moved an item in the Rishus Harabim 4 amos. Asks the Gemara, or suggests the Gemara, this seems to be proof to Rava. The Omar Rava, hamavir chayfetz, if somebody moves an object, mitchilas arba lesoif arba, from one point in Rishus Harabim to 4 amos beyond that spot in the Rishus Harabim, vehaviroi derech olov, and between them, in the middle of that 4 amos, he lifts the object above his head, which is above 10 tefachim, and we know that Rishus Harabim is only up to 10 tefachim, above 10 tefachim is a mokim patur. Rava maintains that if somebody carries from A to B in the Rishus Harabim, where A and B are 4 amos or more apart, then even though he went via the Rishus Harabim above his head, he's chayev. So that it would seem from our Mishnah, proof to Rava, because this person, according to our Mishnah, lifted up an object in the Rishus Harabim. We assume that he lifted it to the point above 10 tefachim off the ground, moved it 4 amos, and put it back down. And that case is osir, and the Gemara assumes that not only is it osir, the Gemara assumes that it's chayev chatos. Answers the Gemara, no. Mikatoni im hoitzi chayev chatos. It doesn't say in the Mishnah that if he did move it 4 amos is chayev chatos. It just says that less than 4 amos is mutter. So obviously more than 4 amos is osir. But chayev chatos, who said? Dilma im hoitzi, maybe if you moved it 4 amos, potter aval osir. It's osir to do it, but he's potter. And then it would not be a proof to Rava. On the contrary, it would even be a question on Rava. Ikad Omri. Others have a different version of this Gemara. Ha hoitzi potter aval osir. They say from the Mishnah says it's mutter to move it up to 4 amos. You move it 4 amos, it's osir. We assume it means it's osir, but he's not chayev. And then the Gemara is saying leimet havet yufta de Rava, in which case our Mishnah will actually be a question against Rava. The Omar Rava hamaver mitchilas daled leseif daled vehevire derech olov. Chayev, we saw Rava. Rava says that if you move it from A to B in Rishus Harabim, going over a mokim patur, that he's going to be chayev. And according to how this second version of the Gemara learns the Mishnah is saying that if you move it 4 amos, it's potter aval osir, it's not chayev. Answers the Gemara, no. Mikatoni hoitzi potter aval osir. Does the Mishnah say that if you move it 4 amos, it's potter aval osir? Dilma im hoitzi chayev chatos. Maybe if you move it 4 amos, it's actually chayev chatos, and then it's proof to Rava. So either way, all we see in our Mishnah is that you're allowed to move it less than 4 amos. More than 4 amos is definitely osir. Whether it's chayev chatos or just potter aval osir is going to depend on whether you hold of Rava, and you do not have any proof in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah doesn't actually tell us what the consequences are of somebody who does move it 4 amos. Continues the next Gemara. Lo yamid odom b'rishus hayochid v'chulu. We saw in the second halacha in the Mishnah, a person may not stand in a private domain and urinate into a public domain, and vice versa. Says the Gemara, Omer of Yosef, Hishtin, if somebody did urinate from one domain to another, Varok, or if somebody did spit from one domain to another, chayev chatos. He's chayev chatos, he's carried something, he's caused something to leave one domain and enter another domain, and if the 2 domains are Rishus Hayochid and Rishus Harabim, he's chayev chatos. Asks the Gemara, V'haba'inon akira v'hanocha me'al gabe mokim dalet v'leka. We know that in order to be chayev for carrying from one Rishus to another, you have to do an akira in one Rishus, which means lifting it up and off the surface of one domain and placing it on a surface in another domain. And we know the halacha is that to be considered a significant surface, to give value and significance to the akira or hanocha, it needs to be off a surface of 4 tefachim. And here, it may have landed, the urine or the spit may have landed on an area of 4 tefachim, but it certainly didn't leave that area. It left his mouth, which is not 4 tefachim, or it left his bladder, or whatever you want to call it, and that's not 4 tefachim. Answers the Gemara, Machshavtoi mashvele mokim. And the way Rashi explains this is that since this person very much needed to get rid of either the urine or the saliva in his mouth, and since he needed it and wanted to get rid of it, then the act of transmission from one domain to another is considered a significant transmission, even though it was not from a surface of 4 tfachim, and therefore it's significant enough to be considered ha'avara and chayev. If you're not going to assume this way, Hada Omar Rava, this that Rava said, Zorak, if somebody throws an object, an item, v'noch b'pi ha'kelev, and it doesn't land on the ground, it lands in the mouth of a dog, or b'pi ha'kivshon, or the entrance of a furnace, and it gets burnt up before it reaches the surface. Chayev chatas, he's chayev chatas. Asks the Gemara, V'aba'inon hanocha al gabi mokim daled v'leka. How are you going to explain that you're chayev there if the object did not land on a surface that was 4 tfachim? And a machshav to mashvelei mokim, since his intention was to transfer the object from one domain to the other, then his thoughts, his intentions, gives significance to this type of transmission, this transfer from one domain to another, and he's chayev. So the same as you say it there, so too in our case, his intention and his need to spit or to urinate gives significance to this type of act. Continues the Gemara. So we understand that if a person is standing in Rishus HaYochid and urinates into the Rishus HaRabim, he has transferred the urine from one domain to another, he'll be chayev. What happens if the Pi Ha'oma, which is the exit of the organ through which he urinates, is also hanging over the Rishus HaRabim, and from there he urinates? So do we say, Mahu, what's the halacha? Do we say Bosar Akira Ozlinon? Do we say that since the urine left the bladder and the bladder is in the Rishus HaYochid, it's considered moving something from one domain to another? Or do we just view it from the place of exit? And since the place of exit, the Pi Ha'oma, is in the Rishus HaRabim, and he's urinating into the Rishus HaRabim, he's not actually transferring from one domain to another, and then it would not be chayev. And the Gemara says, Teiku, we have no way of answering this question, and therefore it's going to stand for the time being. Mirza Shem Mashiach comes, everybody knows, Teiku stands for Tishbi Yataritz Kushis V'Boyes. It's only a remez. The real translation of Teiku is let it stand. It's unresolved. But there's a remez that the Chachomim have given us that Mirza Shem Mashiach comes, all the Teikus in Shas will become verified. Continues the Gemara. V'chein lo yorik. We saw in the Mishnah, the Tanakama say that in the same way as you may not urinate from one domain to another, so too one may not spit from one domain to another. Rabbi Yehuda says, even if you don't spit from one domain to the other, but you're just carrying the saliva in your mouth, once it's been detached, once it's already collected and gathered in his mouth, it's considered a burden, and just walking with it in his mouth for Amis is also asa. Says the Gemara, it seems from the Rabbi Yehuda says that as soon as the saliva in his mouth has become detached, then that means it's gathered in his mouth, then it's already considered a burden, even if doesn't turn it round in his mouth. That means he hasn't played with it in his mouth and turned it into a ball of saliva ready to be spat out. Even before that point, he's not allowed to carry it. V'hotnan. This seems to contradict what we saw in the Mishnah. What we saw in the Mishnah, Hoya oichil devela, if somebody was eating dried figs that were of truma, biyadayim mesuavos, and he was eating it with hands that were dirty, they were soiled. We know the halacha we've learned previously, Masechas Shabbos, that the Chachomim said that the hands that touched truma, they make the truma also to eat. However, truma can only become tomei if they were susceptible to become tomei, and that is that one of the mashkim, one of the 7 liquids, touched these fruits or the truma product, after which, if something tomei touches it, it can make it tomei. So if somebody put this tevela, these pressed figs into his mouth, and his hands were not clean, he had not washed netilas yadayim. V'hichnis yodoi l'toich piv, and then he puts his hand into his mouth whilst these figs of truma are in his mouth, litoil tzroir, in order to remove a little stone, a little pebble from his mouth. So now you've got food, you've got these figs in his mouth, the saliva in his mouth has obviously touched the figs. And now his hands he has not done netilas yadayim, are touching these figs after the saliva has touched the figs. Reb Meir Matami. Reb Meir says that the saliva made the figs susceptible to become tomei, and once he puts his hands into his mouth and touches the truma, they become tomei. Rabbi Yossi Matai, Rabbi Yossi says no. He says the saliva is not make the truma susceptible to becoming tomei. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says hipich ba tomei, lo hipich ba tahir. It depends. If the saliva has gathered in his mouth and he's already turned it over in his mouth, ready, so to speak, for it to be spat out, from that point on it's not anymore considered just an extension of his body, rather it has the status of a liquid, ready to be spat out. From that point on, it makes the truma susceptible to become tomei. But if it was loy hipichba, then it's still considered as part of the body of a person, it's not considered a liquid, and therefore the truma will not be able to become tomei. So you see clearly, according to Rabbi Yehuda, only once it was hipechba, then it's considered a mashke, then it's considered that it's not part of the person anymore, and he's just carrying it, and therefore it's called a mashke. And here in our Mishnah, it seems from Rabbi Yehuda just says, Misha nitlash, as soon as it becomes gathered in his mouth, and doesn't say that there's a condition that he has to have hafich, it has to be turned over in his mouth. Answers the Gemara, Omer Rabbi Yochanan muchlefes hashita. It's clear, or it seems, and Rashi explains what it means is that Rabbi Yehuda obviously changed his mind. And even though in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda seems to maintain that even if loy hipich, it's considered a liquid, it's considered a burden, it's not considered anymore just an extension of the person, when it came to the Mishnah that we just learned here, Mishnah in Kalim, Rabbi Yehuda changed his mind. Rish Lakish Omar, La'olam loy tachlif. Rish Lakish says no, there's no need to say that Rabbi Yehuda changed his mind. What we're actually talking about is when he's got phlegm in his mouth, and if you have phlegm in his mouth, this is not just saliva. Saliva, it could well be that it's only going to become considered a liquid and a burden if it's hafich. But if he's got phlegm in his mouth, then that, as soon as it's, so to speak, detached from wherever it came from, then the phlegm is considered a liquid, even if he's not hafich, and therefore it's considered a burden, even if it's not hafich, and that's what our Mishnah is talking about. Asks the Gemara Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer kichoy v'nitlash, that it says that explicitly that kechoy, which means phlegm, and it became nitlash, and it became, so to speak, detached from its source. At that point, it's already considered detached from the person. My love, can we not assume that the Brisa means roik v'nitlash? Not only if it was his phlegm that became detached, but also his saliva that became detached. And in neither, you need to have the hafich. Says the Gemara, loy kichoy v'nitlash, it's only talking about the phlegm, that when, in the case of phlegm, even if it's not hafich, it's considered a burden, and it's considered a liquid, and detached from the person. However, regarding roik, it must be that it's hafich before it's considered a burden, before it's considered a liquid, and detached from the person. Asks the Gemara of Tanya, we learned in another brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kichoy shenitlash v'chein roikoy shenitlash, the brisa explicitly says, either phlegm that became detached or saliva that became detached. Lo yahalich daled amos, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're not allowed to go 4 amos until he spits it out. So you see clearly that you do not need to have hafich. And then the question comes back that this seems to contradict the Mishnah in Kalim that we saw that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's only considered a liquid if it's hafich. Says the Gemara, Elo Mechaverta, the correct explanation to answer this contradiction is Kedushanin on me. Kara is like Rabbi Yochanan explained that Rabbi Yehuda changed his mind and he now rules like the Mishnah in Kalim. Continues the Gemara. Omar Rish Lakish, Kiach b'fnei rabbi, if somebody spits, or he spits out his saliva or his phlegm in front of his Rebbe, chayev misa. He's chayev misa, shenemar, as it says in the Pasuk. The Pasuk says, V'choiti choymeis nafshoi, kol mesanai ohavu moves. Says the Gemara, kol mesanai ohavu moves, and this is the Torah talking. Al tikru li mesanai. Don't read it, mesanai, those who hate me. Rather, elo li masniai, those who cause others to hate me. And somebody who spits in front of his Rebbe is degrading the kavod for the teachers of Torah, and it's going to cause people to hate the Torah. And the punishment for that is misa. Ask the Gemara, v'hameinas onis. Well, is it not talking about if somebody has to spit out his phlegm in front of his Rebbe? Does that not mean that he's forced to do that? He's not doing it out of choice. He's not doing it in order to degrade his Rebbe. Says the Gemara, Kiach v'rok kamrinon. We're talking about if somebody, he coughed and then he spat out in front of his Rebbe, and in that case, it's clearly degrading and he's chayev misa. Even though the saliva and the phlegm that came into his mouth may have been an oinus, he may not have had a choice, he may have just had a cold or been sick, but nobody said you have to spit it out in front of your Rebbe. You could have spat it into a piece of material, or you could have turned away to spat it out. The spitting it in front of his Rebbe, that's something which never has to be done, and somebody who does that is degrading a Talmud Chacham, degrading the Torah, and is chayev misa. Says the next Mishnah, Lo yamid odom b'reshus hayochid v'yishte b'reshus harabim. We've already learnt about this in Mesechus Shabbos and at the beginning of Mesechus Yiruvin. The person may not stand in reshus hayochid and put his head out of the window over the reshus harabim and yishte b'reshus harabim and drink from a cup or from water which is in the reshus harabim. What's our main concern? That he's going to take this vessel, the cup with water, and bring it into him to where his body is, to where he is in the Reshus HaYochid. He'll be carrying from Reshus HaRabim into Reshus HaYochid. Reshus HaYochid v'yishte Reshus HaRabim v'yishte Reshus HaYochid. The same applies. A person may not stand in Reshus HaRabim, put his head into Reshus HaYochid and drink there. Again, we're afraid he's going to take the vessel with the water out towards him in the Reshus HaRabim. He's only allowed to do this if not only he puts his head into the other domain, but he puts his head and most of his body is leaning into the other domain, and in that case we are not afraid that he's going to take the cup of water out into the domain where he's standing. V'chein begas, the Mishnah adds on, we'll have to see exactly what this means, but in the case of a wine press, the same applies. That we'll see in the Gemara, but at this point it means that if you want to drink some of the wine in the wine press, and he's standing outside the wine press, he's only allowed to do that if his head and most of his body is over the wine press, and otherwise he's not allowed to do that. And we'll see in the Gemara whether this is a halacha in Hilchas Shabbos, or whether it's a halacha in Hilchas Maisa. Says the Gemara, Reisha Rabbonon v'Sefer Reb Meir. We saw in the Mishnah Daf Tzadik Ches Amud Beis at the bottom that we learnt at the beginning of today's Shir that it says Oymeid Odom b'Reshus Hayochid u'Metaltel b'Reshus Harabim u'Metaltel b'Reshus Hayochid. We saw in the Mishnah that a person is allowed to stand in one domain and move something in a different domain, keeping it in that domain, and you're allowed to do that, and we're not afraid that he's going to take that object and bring it towards himself in his domain. And here we see that a person is not allowed to be in one reshus and put his head into a different domain, even if his whole body is not in the other domain, just his head is in that domain, where the water that he's taking in the other domain is staying in that domain. He's putting it into his mouth, which is the hanocha in his mouth. And we say you're not allowed to do that. You're only allowed to do it if most of his body is also in that domain. Why should this Mishnah be following Reb Meir that says that we are afraid that person is going to bring the item towards himself, and the Mishnah on Daf Tzadik Ches Amud Beis seems not to be afraid? Asks the Gemara, Reisha Rabbonon v'Sefer Reb Meir. The first Mishnah on Daf Tzadik Ches Amud Beis is following the Rabbonon that we're not concerned, and Sefer, which means this Mishnah, is like Reb Meir, that we are concerned. Answers the Gemara, Omer of Yosef, b'chafetzim shetzrichim loy v'divrei hakel. The whole Machlekes, Rabbanan and Reb Meir, are items that he doesn't necessarily need for himself. However, here we're talking about water. We're talking about that he's drinking, and since he needs that water for himself, we are more afraid, and even the Rabbanon will say that in this case we're afraid that he's going to take the water and bring it towards himself, towards where he's standing, and therefore they only allowed it if most of his body is out of into the other reshus as well. Continues the Gemara, Iboyeluhu, Karamelis Mai. Is a person allowed to stand in a karamelis? The Mishnah is discussing standing in Reshus HaYochid and drinking from Reshus HaRabim, or vice versa. What happens if he's standing in a karamelis and one's not midrabanon, one is not allowed to take something from a karamelis to either Reshus HaYochid or a Reshus HaRabim? The question is he allowed to stand in a karamelis and put his head over into either Reshus HaYochid or Reshus HaRabim and drink that way, even if most of his body is not in that Reshus as well? Answers the Gemara, Omar Abaya, he. Abaya says that in the same way as one is not allowed to stand in Reshus HaYochid or Reshus HaRabim and drink in the opposite, in the other domain, so too regarding a karamelis, one's not allowed to carry from a karamelis to either of those Reshuyos. Therefore, one cannot stand in a karamelis with one's head in either Reshus HaYochid or Reshus HaRabim and drink that way. Omar Rava. Rava says no. He gufa gzeira. Putting one's head into another reshus and drinking, biblically speaking, should be okay. The only reason it's asa is because we're concerned maybe he's going to bring the water from the other domain into where he's standing. So you're saying that in the case of Reshus HaYochid and Reshus HaRabim, that it's only also because of a gzeira. V'nan neikum v'nigzer gzeira lo gzeira. We're going to make another gzeira on the first gzeira. Then not only Reshus HaYochid and Reshus HaRabim, this is true, even in a karamelis, where the whole issa of karamelis, the whole issa to carry from a karamelis to either Reshus HaYochid or Reshus HaRabim is only a gezerah that we're afraid you'll get confused with the regular Reshus HaYochid and Reshus HaRabim. So we're going to make a double gezerah? Omar Abaya. Mino aminulo. Abaya says, where do I know this from? Abaya, who said that one's even from a karamelis to Reshus HaYochid or Reshus HaRabim, it's also to drink that way on Shabbos. Where do I know that from? Abaya says, I hear what you're saying, that it's a gzeira legzeira, but I have a source for what I'm saying. The Mishnah says, the last two words in the Mishnah, v'chein begat. In the case of a wine press, the same halacha applies. And how do we understand this, the case of the gat? The person is standing on the edge of the gas, and he's putting his head over into the wine press, that he's not allowed to drink that way. And Rashi explains that this person is standing in a Reshus HaRabim. He's putting his head over into the gas, into the wine press to drink from it. And let's understand, is this wine press or Reshus HaYochid? If it is, then the case of V'chein Begas is exactly the case of the beginning of the Mishnah, that he's standing in the Reshus HaRabim, putting his head over into Reshus HaYochid. The Mishnah doesn't need to repeat it twice. So it must be that the gat is actually a karamelis, and not a Reshus HaYochid, and the person is standing in Reshus HaRabim. So when it says v'chein begat, what the Mishnah means, not only from Reshus HaYochid to Reshus HaRabim we have this issue, but from a karamelis to Reshus HaRabim we have the same issue, that one's only allowed to drink that way if most of one's body is hanging over the gut. So Abaya says, here's proof to what I'm saying. Rav Omar, well, how's Rav going to explain that? Rav is going to say no. In the case of karamelis and Hilchos Shabbos, we're not going to say that if you're standing in a Reshus HaRabim and your head is over a karamelis, or if you're standing in a karamelis and your head is into a Reshus HaRabim, that you're not allowed to drink that way. You are allowed to drink that way, even if most of your body is not hanging over. What does it mean? V'chein begas. V'chein begas is talking about a different halacha. It's not talking about drinking from the wine press on Shabbos while standing outside the wine press. It's talking about inyan meiser. There's a halacha regarding meiser, that somebody who eats a temporary type of eating, then he's allowed to eat without taking meiser. So if somebody is in the wine press and drinking, that's called a temporary type of drinking. We'll soon see in what case, but that's considered a temporary type of drinking. and he's allowed to drink that way even without taking Maisa. The question is, if he's standing outside the wine press and his head is hanging over the wine press, is he allowed to drink that way, or are we concerned that he's going to take the wine that he's drinking out of the wine press, and then it will not be considered a temporary drinking, and then he's not allowed to continue drinking without taking Maisa? So the Mishnah says, V'chein begat, you're only allowed to drink from the gas without taking Maisa if most of your body is hanging over the gas, and then there's no concern that you're going to take the wine out of the area above the wine press. Let's see this inside. V'chein Amar of Sheishes, V'chein begat l'inyan Maisa, same as Rava, so says Rav Sheishes, that the words V'chein begat are talking about Maisa. Ditnan we learned in the Mishnah, Shoisin al Hagat, a person who wants to drink wine in the wine press, on the wine press, he's allowed to. Bein bechamin, bein betzainon, irrespective of whether he diluted that wine with cold water or with hot water, or potter. Divrei Reb Meir, that's what Reb Meir holds, he does not need to take Maisa. It's considered a temporary type of drinking, and therefore he's allowed to drink that way. Rebbe Eliezer bar Tzadok, mechayev. Rebbe Eliezer bar Tzadok holds that since he diluted the wine, it doesn't matter if he diluted it with cold or with hot water, it's considered a permanent type of drinking and is chayev maisa. The Chachamim say, alachamin chayev. If he diluted the wine with hot water, then he's chayev, because the remaining wine, he's not going to toss it back into the wine press because the warm water is going to destroy the wine. So when he's going to drink the whole cup, it's a permanent drinking and he's chayev. Valatzayin and potter. However, if he dilutes it with cold water, then indeed he's potter from Maisa, because any wine that's left over in his cup, he'll toss it back into the wine press. Either way, we see here that you're only allowed to drink this water if you're al hagas, if you're in the wine press. The question is, if you're standing outside the wine press and your head is over the wine press, is that sufficient? If he's not in the wine press, so for that, v'chein begat, Rav and Rav Sheisha say, that's what our Mishnah is coming to say. You're only allowed to do that if most of your body is hanging over the wine press. But if just your head is over the wine press, then we're afraid you're going to take the wine out of the wine press, and then you'll be chayiv with Maisa, and therefore you're not allowed to do that. Continues the next Mishnah. And before we learn the Mishnah, we'll just introduce what's going on here. Back in the days, homes were made with flat roofs. If it would rain, then there would be little pipes or little crevices in the roof that would channel the water towards the edge of the roof. What's going to happen with this water, the edge of the roof? So there were one of two options. Either the water, what they would do is they would put a little frame around the roof that would, so to speak, collect the water. The water would drain towards one side. Obviously there was some type of a slope or something that made the water drain to one side. When the water came to that side, then there were one or two things that happened. Either there were some small holes in the edge of this frame, and the water would then pour out onto a gutter, a horizontal gutter going all along the roof, and the gutter would typically be anything within 3 tefachim from the rooftop and below it, which means that the gutter was considered an extension from the rooftop, and all the water would be gathered in this gutter, and then the gutter would be slanting downwards to one side of the gutter, and all the rainwater would then fall out of the gutter onto the ground below it. That's one thing that they would do. And this gutter is called a mazchila. There was another way of draining the water, that the water would drain to one corner of the roof, and then from this corner there was a drain pipe that was vertical, that was usually, the drain pipe would come right down and would extend below the roof more than 3 tefachim. It was not so close to the top of the roof, it would actually carry the water considerably down the corner of the building or the house, and then it would fall out. Now a person could do one of two things with either the mazchila, either the edge of the gutter, or with the end of the drain. He could either let the water just fall down into his mouth or into a vessel, a utensil he's holding. That's one option. Or he can actually put his mouth or his vessel right next to the edge of the exit of either the drain or the drain pipe or the gutter, and then receive the water directly. The difference being that when you just catch the water, then your first contact with the water is in mid-air, and mid-air is not considered a domain, it's considered a mokim ptur. And then it doesn't really matter if it's above 10 tvachim off the ground or below 10 tvachim off the ground. It's considered, the air itself is considered a mokim ptur. However, there's another option, and that is to actually be mitzarif. That means koilet. Koilet means to catch the water. Mitzarif means when you attach your vessel or your mouth to the edge of either the mazchila or the tzinor, and that way, because you're taking it straight off the end of this pipe, it's considered as if you're removing the water from the pipe into your vessel. Now it depends what the status is of the mazchila, or the status of that means the edge of the mazchila, the end of the gutter, or the end of the drain pipe, depending what the status is of that as to how serious what you're doing is. For example, the mazchila, being that it's so close to the top of the roof, and the roof itself is always at least 10 tfachim off the ground. The roof itself is a reshus hayochid. Even if the gutter is a little bit lower, within 3 tfachim, and it's within 10 tfachim off the ground, however, since it's an extension from the roof, it has the status of a reshus hayochid. And if you take something directly off this gutter into your mouth, or into a vessel that you're holding in the reshus harabim, then you're actually considered as if you're taking the water from a reshus hayochid into reshus harabim. And that is seriously asa. In the case of the tzinor, in the case of the drain pipe, where it's typically below 3 tvachim from the roof, that's not considered a reshus hayochid. And then it's going to depend whether this tzinor, whether this pipe is 4 tvachim wide. If it's 4 tvachim wide, then it depends. If it's above 10 tvachim off the ground, it's a proper reshus hayochid. If it's lower than 10 tvachim, then it's not reshus hayochid, but it will be considered a karmelis. And so that means the only time where really it should be mutter is if you're directly taking from the tzinor, is only providing that it's less than 10 tvachim off the ground, which means you're not taking it from reshus hayochid, and it's less than 4 tvachim wide, which means you're not taking it from a karmelis, in which case you can then take it directly from the end of this drain pipe straight into your mouth or straight into your vessel. So again, in the case of catching the water, it makes no difference how far, whether you're catching it above 10 tvachim off the ground or below 10 tvachim off the ground. It doesn't matter whether you're catching the water coming from the drain pipe or you're catching the water coming from the gutter. Either way, it's mutter. When it comes to taking directly, being mitzarif, attaching your vessel or mouth to the mazchila and the tzinor, then it's follows. Regarding the drain pipe, regarding the gutter, it's always going to be considered as if you're taking from reshus hayochid into reshus harabim, because the gutter is so close to the top of the roof and the roof is reshus hayochid. That's always going to be osar. Regarding attaching your kli, your vessel, to the end of the drain pipe, there it depends. If it's less than 10 tvachim off the ground and the gutter is less than 4 tvachim wide, then it's mutter. If this drain pipe is less than 10 tvachim off the ground and it's 4 tvachim wide, you're not allowed to take straight off it because you're taking from a karmelis into the reshus harabim. And if the gutter is less than 4 tvachim wide and it's above 10 tvachim off the ground, then again, that should be mutter. However, over there we're concerned that since if the gutter would be 4 tvachim wide, and it's above 10 tvachim, it would be carrying from reshus hayochid into reshus harabim. So therefore, if it's above 10 tvachim, even if it's not 4 tvachim wide, and therefore would be considered a mokim ptur, nonetheless it's also to do it. So we shouldn't get confused between less than 4 tvachim and more than 4 tvachim. Those are the rules, and that's what we're going to learn now in the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Koileit odom mina mazchila, a person is allowed to catch water coming off the gutter. Lemata me'asara tvachim, if the vessel that's holding, that's going to catch the water, is below 10 tvachim, and as we saw before, Rashi explains that this is true even above 10 tvachim. And the only reason the Mishnah says less than 10 tvachim is in contrast of tziruf of a tzinor that we're going to see in a moment. But regarding the catching water from a mazchila, from the gutter, and we're going to see the same applies even to a tzinor, it makes no difference. Catching water in a vessel is always mutar. Uminat tzinor, however, there's one halacha which applies to a tzinor, which applies to taking water from a drain pipe, is mikol mokim shoisa. He's allowed to drink in any which case, even with tziruf. That means in the case of in the Reisha, it's only koilet, you can catch the water. Catching water you can always do. However, regarding the tzinor, not only are you allowed to catch the water coming out of the drain pipe, you're even allowed to attach your vessel straight to the mouth of the drain pipe in order to receive the water. We'll see, providing it's less than 10 tvachim and off the ground, and providing that the gutter is not 4 tvachim wide. And that is allowed. However, above 10 tvachim, mitzaref is always osir. You're not allowed to attach a vessel to the end of a drain pipe if it's to the end of a gutter. To the end of the gutter, you're not allowed to do tziruf. You're only allowed to do koilet. You're only allowed to catch the water. You're not allowed to attach the kli to the end of this gutter, for the simple reason that the gutter, as we said, is an extension of the roof, which is the Rishus HaYochid, and receiving the water into a kli from the Rishus HaYochid when you're standing in the Rishus HaRabim is asa. Says the Gemara, koileit in, talking about the mazchila, you're allowed to catch the water coming off a gutter, aval matzaref loy. You're not allowed to put your vessel to the edge of the exit, directly attached to the end of the gutter and receive the water. That you're not allowed to do. Ma'itama, why not? As we explained, Omer of Nachman, Hocha b'mazchila pochis megimel samuch legag oskinon. We're talking about that there's less than 3 tvachim from the gutter to the roof. To call pochis megimel samuch legag kigag domi. We know there's a rule of lavud that anything that's within 3 tvachim is considered as if it's an extension, and therefore this gutter is considered an extension of the roof. The roof is considered a Rishus HaYochid, and you're not allowed to take something directly from the Rishus HaYochid into another Rishus. Tanya Namihachi. We see this also in a Brisa. Oy meid Odom b'Rishus HaYochid, umagbia yodoi lemailo me'asara tvachim. A person can stand in the Rishus HaYochid, lift his hand up to above 10 tvachim from where he's standing, lepochis mishloisha samuch legag, and to a place which is within 3 tvachim, close to the roof above his, v'koilet, and he's allowed to catch the water coming out of it, but you're not allowed to put your vessel to the mouth of the gutter which is on the roof above yours, and this is to do with the halachas of carrying water from one Rishus HaYochid to another Rishus HaYochid without an Eruv. And we've discussed that previously. So if I'm on my Rishus HaYochid and I want to take on my rooftop and I want to take water coming off the gutter off your rooftop, so I'm allowed to catch the water because then I'm not taking it straight off your rooftop. However, I'm not allowed to put my vessel to the mouth of the gutter because that's considered as if I'm actually taking the water from your rooftop onto mine. In the absence of an Eruv, that would be Asa. Tani Idach, we saw also in another Brisa, Lo yameid Odom b'Rishus HaYochid, the person is not allowed to stand in Rishus HaYochid, v'yagbia yodoi l'maylo me'asara tvachim, and lift his hand up to a point above 10 tvachim from where he is, lepochis megimel samuch legag, to the place which is within 3 tvachim from a rooftop, v'yitzarif, and attach the kli to the mouth of the gutter. That's asa. Avul koiletu, but you can catch the water coming down, v'shoisa, and drink from it, because you are receiving the water not straight from that gutter, you're receiving it from mid-air, which is considered a mokim p'tur. Continues the Gemara. Min hatzinoir mikol mokim shoisa. We saw that when it comes to the drain pipe, the vertical drain pipe, which is more than 3 tvachim away from the roof, there not only are you allowed to catch the water coming from it, but you're even allowed to attach your vessel straight to the mouth of this drain pipe, and you're allowed to take the water, so to speak, take it straight from the drain pipe to the vessel, to the Rishus HaRabim where you're standing. And we said that that's providing that it's less than 10 tvachim off the ground, and that way it will not be a Reshus HaYochid even if it's 4 tvachim wide, and providing it's not 4 tvachim wide, because otherwise it would have the status of a caramelis, and then it's mutter. Says the Gemara Tana, Im yesh b'tzinner daled al daled asur. If the tzinner, if this drain pipe is 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim, then even if it's less than 10 tvachim off the ground, and therefore it's not a Reshus HaYochid, however it is a caramelis, and one's not allowed to take water straight from a caramelis into Reshus Harabim, mipnei shehu kamotzim Reshus to Reshus, it's also midrabanon to take something from a caramelis to Reshus Harabim, and therefore it's also. And when it says in the Mishnah that you're allowed to attach your kli to the end of this drain pipe, is talking about that the drain pipe is not 4 tvachim wide, and therefore it's not considered a caramelis, it's less than 10 tvachim off the ground, and therefore there's no reason to get confused with the domain of Reshus HaYochid, and therefore it's mutter. Continues the next Mishnah. Boir b'Reshus Harabim. If in the Reshus Harabim you have a pit, v'chulyasoi, and you have the mound of dirt, of earth, that's piled around the edge of this pit, Gavoya Asara Tvachim, and at this point we assume not only is the pit 10 Tvachim deep, but the Chulyosai surrounding it is also another 10 Tvachim high. In that case, Chaloin Sha'al Gabov, if there's a window above this pit, Memali Nimenu B'Shabbos, you're allowed to throw a pail out of the window and draw water from this pit and draw it up into the Reshus HaYochid, into the home. And the Gemara will discuss what we're talking about here. Similarly, Ashpo, if you have a trash pile, B'Reshus Harabim, in the Reshus Harabim just adjacent to a building, we'll soon see how adjacent it is, Gavoya Asara Tvachim, if this trash pile is 10 tvachim high, which means it has the status of Reshus HaYochid, then Chaloin Shal Gabov, if there's a window of the home above this 10 tvachim of the trash pile, Shoifchin Netoicha Mayim B'Shabbos, you're allowed to pour water from the building, from the Reshus HaYochid, onto this ashpa on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, B'mayoskinon, what are we talking about here? Ilema B'Smucha, we're talking about this pit in the Reshus Harabim, and we said that the pit was 10 tvachim deep. The wall around the earth, the mound around the pit, was another 10 tvachim high. Then in that case, you're allowed to draw water from it into the Reshus HaYochid next to it. Asks the Gemara, how close is this boir from the window? Ilem b'smucha, is it adjacent? That means it's right next to the building. There's not even 4 tvachim between the home, between the bayis and this pit. Why do I need that there's a wall around the pit of 10 tvachim high? Why is it not sufficient that there's the pit itself is 10 tvachim deep? The pit is 10 tvachim deep. It's considered a Reshus HaYochid, so I'm allowed to put my pail straight into the pit, which is Reshus HaYochid, draw it up into the home. There's no Reshus Harabim between the two. If there was 4 tvachim between the home and this pit, then the area in between would be Reshus Harabim, but it would only be Reshus Harabim up to 10 tvachim high. Then we would understand that I need that the pit itself has walls of 10 tvachim around it, in order that the pail, as soon as it reaches the 10 tvachim airspace, which is the airspace of Reshus Harabim, it's already within the walls of the pit. It's Reshus HaYochid. Then it's okay. And in the absence of those walls, then as soon as it reaches 10 tvachim off the ground level, it's in the Reshus Harabim. And then drawing water from the pit, which is Reshus HaYochid, that will be asa. But the Gemara says, if the pit is so close to the home that it's not considered a Reshus Harabim, then I don't need those walls going around the pit. Omer Rav Huna says, the Mishnah is talking about when the pit is 4 tvachim away from the wall. The only reason you're allowed to draw from that pit on Shabbos is because it has the wall, the mound around it, which is 10 tvachim. However, if there isn't that wall around it, then the pit itself is the Reshus HaYochid, the home is the Reshus HaYochid, the airspace above the pit is the Reshus Harabim. And that would be also, you're not allowed to carry from Reshus HaYochid to Reshus HaYochid going through Reshus Harabim. That's how Rav Huna explained it. Rabbi Yochanan said no. Afilu teimu b'smucha. The truth is, we're talking about that the pit is close to the home. It does not, the airspace above the pit is not considered a Reshus Harabim. If so, why do I need the mound on top of the pit? Hakamashmalon, says Rabbi Yochanan. The Mishnah is coming to tell us the boyer v'chulyosei mitztarfim la'asara. It's not that the pit is 10 tefachim and you need another 10 tefachim above it. No, you only need 10 tefachim all in. And then the 10 tefachim all together, it's a Reshus HaYochid, you can draw from there to the house, because there's no 4 tefachim between the two. It's going to be considered carrying from Reshus HaYochid to the Reshus HaYochid. And the reason we mention the mound is to teach us an added chiddush, that if the mound, together with the depth of the pit, together make 10 tefachim and not more, that suffices to consider the entire pit as a Reshus HaYochid. And we discussed this previously on Daf Ayin Ches, a little bit more in detail, the boyer and the chulya, how they blend together to make a single measure of 10 tefachim. Continues the Gemara. Ashba b'Reshus Harabim v'chulu. We saw in the Mishnah that when you have a trash pile in the Reshus Harabim, then if it's 10 tefachim high, it has the status of a Reshus HaYochid, and one's allowed to throw water onto it from the bais. Says the Gemara, V'lo yichayshin on shemot tinotil ashpa. Are you not concerned that some of the trash pile is going to be cleared away, and then it's going to lose its height of 10 tefachim? It will no longer have the status of Reshus HaYochid, and the people will not be aware of it, and they will continue throwing things from the home onto the trash pile, and the trash pile will not be Reshus HaYochid, it will be considered carrying from a Reshus HaYochid to a different Reshus. Asks the Gemara, are we not concerned about that? V'harovin barav ada omar Yitzchak. There was a story in a mavui. Shetzidoy echod kolo. That means one end, the opening of the mavui was obviously from Reshus Harabim. The back of the mavui, that's where there were entrances to the different courtyards, the chatzeris. The two sides, one side, tzidoy echod kolo layam, there was actually the sea. It was the sea, the banks of the sea were on one side, and we know that since the banks have a vertical height of 10 tefachim, it's considered a wall, considered a surrounding a mechitza. But tzidei echad, and on the other side, kolo la'ashba, it was piled up with a trash pile, and it was a kosher, it was okay. Uba ma'aseh lifnei Rebbe, and they came to Rebbe to ask him, is one allowed to rely on such a mavui and assume that it's considered closed on both sides? Rebbe says, I cannot tell you it's okay, and I cannot tell you it's not okay. I cannot tell you it's okay, because I am afraid that the ashba, the trash pile, is going to be taken away, and then it will not be 10 tefachim high, and it will be a mavui that's totally broken open. Or we're afraid that the sea will wash up debris and earth to the edges, to the banks of the sea, and then the wall of the edge of the sea, which is the wall of the mavui, will not be entirely vertical. It will be very, very a shallow slope. And we've learned previously in the Gemara how shallow that slope has to be. In order for it to be considered a vertical wall, it has to reach the height of 10 tefachim within 4 amis. And if the sea piles up dirt, then it will be a more shallow slope than that, and it will not be considered a wall anymore. And again, the mavui will not have a wall. Also, lo omar, and I cannot tell you that it's not okay. Lo omar boy do kaimin mechitzis, because now at this point the sea bank is 10 tefachim high, is vertical, and the trash pile is 10 tefachim high. I cannot say that you cannot use the mavui, but I am concerned that there's going to become an issue here. So you see clearly that Rebbe was afraid that maybe the trash pile would be lowered, would be taken away. So why in our Mishnah are we not afraid? Says the Gemara, Lo kashya, it's not a contradiction. Ha de yochid, ha de rabbim. If the trash pile belongs to a single person, then it could well be removed, and then it will lose its status of Reshus HaYochid. It will lose its status as a wall. However, in the case of a trash pile that belongs to the public, there we're not concerned anyone's going to move it away, and therefore in the case of our Mishnah, we're talking about a trash pile that belongs to the public. Since it's 10 tefachim high, one's allowed to pour from the home onto the ashpa. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next year, we're going to continue the next Mishnah.